So last we left off, we were looking at fitting this Wiener filter equation. And what we had done was to write this complicated equation here as a simple matrix multiply. And so we would turn this equation here into xw equals lw times yw. And this is sort of the approach that we're just in general taking for solving linear systems. If you have multiplications that are linear and then additions, you can always simplify the equation to some form x equals L times y. And then, as we talked last lecture, that's really simple to solve in MATLAB. It's just one line of code where we take this yw, we take its pseudo-inverse, and we simply write Lw equals xw times yw pseudo-inverse. And so that's this equation that we see right down here. And what we did in these slides here at the end of last lecture is we rearranged the equations for the Wiener filter. We arranged this so that it was in this form x equals L times w. And so concretely, this matrix here was xw, and this matrix here was yw. And so in homework 4, if some of you have already started it, you'll see that the last question is exactly fitting this Wiener filter. And so you'll have some experience forming this large matrix. This is basically the hardest part of making the Wiener filter. And then after that, you'll just call your pseudo-inverse command in MATLAB, calculating LW, and you'll be able to decode. And as we saw at the very end of last lecture, if we looked at the performance of the Wiener filter, turn up my volume. We'll see that the performance is very, very good. And so the success rate, again, is almost 100%. The monkey's able to move the cursor directly to the target. And when he gets to the target, he's able to hold on the target, hold the cursor still over the target. And so there's this question that Sohaib asked at the end of last lecture, which is, what is the amount of history that we use in the Wiener filter? Because that's a really important parameter. So how many bins of data do we look back to in the past? And we talked about how we can really only fit this through optimization and by giving the monkey different decoders with different amounts of history. Because depending on the amount of history you use, there will be a different lag in the way the cursor responds to the monkey's updated commands. And so if you use too much lag, then data from too far ago will be affecting your cursor right now, and that'll lead to this really poor controllability. Whereas if you have too short of a lag, you'll have a very noisy cursor because your neural data is very noisy and you're not smoothing enough of it. And so we talked about how the optimal amount of history that we found in experiments was somewhere around 250 milliseconds. And in your homework, you'll be working with a history of 100 milliseconds. And so this is a pretty reasonable amount of history to use to achieve this performance here. So concretely, this video was taken for, so it actually isn't p, but it's p divided by bin size. Or the amount of bins that you go back is 250 milliseconds. So p is equal to 250 milliseconds over bin size. And in this video that we just showed you over here, the amount of history that we use in the Wiener filter was exactly 250 milliseconds. All right, so any questions on the Wiener filter? I know we went over it quickly at the end of last lecture, but happy to answer any questions before we move on. Nathan?
Very tiny. This notation for p, is that just like to show that it's capital?
Yes, that's just to show it's capital. Yeah. All right. So until a few years ago, the way that we wanted to compare how these different decoders work was to quantify their performance. But you can imagine how difficult this might be because different labs prefer different decoders. Right? In Professor Chenoy's lab, we used to always use Kalman filters. We still use Kalman filters. But over in Pittsburgh, they use the optimal linear estimator. And in Duke, they use Wiener filters. And so the other problem now is that all of us run slightly different types of tasks. And so I showed you a video of this grid task where the monkey is reaching to all these different targets on a grid. But other people might use a task where the monkey is just reaching to one target in randomly located space. And they could have different hold times. They could have different target sizes. And so in general, it's really hard to compare these metrics across different studies, across different labs. Furthermore, your monkeys could have different quality neural signals coming off of their arrays. And so there was this metric proposed called fits throughput, which was trying to be independent of all of these different experimental conditions. And so if your task was a bit easier, fits throughput would penalize you. And so on an easier task, you might expect that you would have a higher success rate, for example. And so your success rate would be high, but then fits throughput would penalize you in terms of the task being easier. And so this isn't a perfect measure by any means, but it's one that the field has started to adopt. And if we just go back to a study, so this study here, the Wiener filter, the WF, is from Berkeley, UC Berkeley, from Jose Carmina's lab. And this PV here is by Don Taylor and colleagues in Pittsburgh. What we saw when we calculated fits throughput across all these studies was that, in fact, Wiener filter does seem to do a bit better than the population vector / the OLE, the optimal linear estimator. And then more concretely, in Professor Chenoy's lab, what we actually did is we ran all of these different decoders at once to really get a good quantification on which decoder is better than the others. And so on this plot, we'll just ignore a few decoders for now, so ignore all the orange ones, the green ones. And what we have here in blue are optimal linear estimators. So remember, optimal linear estimator was just saying that the neural data at time k is equal to a matrix time, the kinematics at time k are equal to a matrix times the neural data at time k. And then what we did on the x-axis is we varied the amount of smoothing that you do over that neural data. And so these 25 SDs, these 50 SDs, are just the standard deviation of these Gaussian kernels that we talked about last lecture. And we see something that we might expect. So when you have no smoothing, the performance is very poor. As you add smoothing, the performance goes up. And so on the y-axis, it's just a measure of bit rate, similar to what we talked about in discrete decoding. As we increase the amount of smoothing, we get higher and higher performance. And then as we increase smoothing too much, to say smoothing with a standard deviation of 200 milliseconds, and so then the Gaussian kernel is really smoothing data over, say, 500 milliseconds, the performance declines. And that's exactly this effect that we talked about, where if you incorporate more history, you're going to have the decoder having a lag in the system that makes it less controllable. Anjali?
If the standard deviation is 200, why are you kind of smoothing over 500
Yeah.
milliseconds, given that it's a causal filter?
Yeah, so it might not be 500. It might be something like 400. But if we plot a Gaussian, and then we said that the Gaussian is causal, so it's 0 everywhere less than 0, and then it goes up, and then it looks like a Gaussian bump. We remember that one standard deviation is the amount on the x-axis, such that the area under this curve is 67% divided by 2, since I've thrown away half of the Gaussian. And so even though, so this standard deviation here is quantifying the distance to about this point, whereas the Gaussian kernel will still have non-zero values. And really, when you get up to 3 SD is when you capture 99% of what's under the curve in the Gaussian. All right, and then over here in purple, what we did is with the same monkeys on the same exact task, we ran a Wiener filter. And this Wiener filter had a history of 250 milliseconds. And what we saw is that the Wiener filter achieved a bit rate of 3.5, which was higher than any bit rate achieved by the OLE. And so from this, we saw that indeed the Wiener filter does perform better than the optimal linear estimator, as we might expect, because the Wiener filter is making an optimal use of the history. It's fitting an individual matrix for each of those terms in the past. All right, any questions on that? All right, so we're done with Wiener filters for now. And this is setting up our next handout, which is lecture 13, the Kalman filter. So in the last lecture, in handout 12, in lecture 12, we talked about the linear algebra machinery that helps us to fit all these linear decoders. And we put this to use in building both the optimal linear estimator and the Wiener filter. And we saw that with those, you can already get really great performance. And as we discussed, several groups, such as the video in 60 minutes, are using optimal linear estimators. So you guys already know the techniques to build decoders that can perform at those sorts of levels. But what if we have additional information into how a decoder should work? And so it could be that the cursor has inertia. And so if it's going to the right at a pretty high velocity, at the next time bin, it should still be going to the right at a moderate to high velocity, whereas it would only really change directions from right to left if it was going right at a very slow velocity near 0, right? This could incorporate the dynamics of a robotic arm. So you could have a model of how the different joints of the robotic arm interact to lead to naturalistic movements. And so there is a natural way to incorporate this information into a decoder. And the way to do this is through an algorithm called the Kalman filter. And that's what we'll be talking about through the rest of this handout. And so the reading for this lecture is mostly for fun. This is a paper from Professor Shenoy's lab by Vikash Gilja and Paul Nyujukian. And it's called A High-Performance Neural Prosthesis Enabled by Control Algorithm Design. And so in this paper, they used a Kalman filter. And what they did is they made some little tweaks to the Kalman filter that really had a profound effect on performance. It doubled the performance of Kalman filters and really made Kalman filters the state-of-the-art decoder in the literature period. So this paper here, which is from 2012, still represents the highest performance neural prosthesis that we have in the literature today. And it's based exactly off of the Kalman filter. All right, so so first, we have our block diagram of our motor prosthesis. And just to come back to a high level, again, we're just going to be working on decoding the movements of a motor prosthesis. So a few notes on the Kalman filter. The Kalman filter has been sort of the workhorse for motor neural prostheses since 2009. The best performing decoders in the literature have somewhere included a Kalman filter. So the decoders that have achieved the best performance that we've measured have at some point incorporated a Kalman filter, whether that be over the kinematics, as in Gilja and Yujukian, and what we're going to talk about in this lecture, or in other sorts of ways. That's this paper over here, but we won't get into that. The Kalman filter has wide applications in almost any field where data is modeled to evolve in principled ways over time. And so by that, all I mean is that if you have what are called dynamics, if you have a variable that you're trying to infer, some xk, and it's related through time to itself, so xk is some function of xk minus 1, then knowing what the state, xk we'll just call the state, knowing what the state was at the previous time step, so this could be, for example, the decoded kinematics, could be informative of what the decoded kinematics are at the next time step. And so in any field where you can write this equation for the variable you're trying to infer, a Kalman filter will probably help you, because the Kalman filter will be able to incorporate this information into your inference. And so the Kalman filter is a tool that won't just be useful for this class, but will help you in several other contexts. So more asides, the Kalman filter requires a lot of prerequisites to learn. And so this includes EE263, linear dynamical systems, and EE278, which is going over statistics and statistical signal processing. We, of course, recognize that these are not prerequisites for the class. And so you won't be able to, or you won't be required to know how we derive the Kalman filter. However, if you're interested, a class that I recommend is Engineering 207B, which is taught by Sanjay Lal. And there was another class that used to cover the Kalman filter called EE363. It was taught by Stephen Boyd, but I think it's no longer offered because when I checked Explore courses last night, it was no longer listed. But the notes that Professor Lal uses in 207B for Kalman filter are actually the exact same notes that Stephen Boyd used in EE363 for Kalman filter. We'll cover the Kalman filter at a very high intuitive level. By this, we'll mean to say that we're going to, we'll provide you with the algorithm so that you can implement it. And on homework 5, you will be actually computing the Kalman filter and using the Kalman filter to decode neural data. And we will discuss it enough so that you can understand basically what's going on and how to use it. And so when you talk with someone and they're talking about Kalman filters, you guys should have the intuition to understand what they're talking about and speak the same language as them. But we won't get into the nitty-gritty derivation of it. We have provided a derivation of it on Canvas for anyone who is curious and wants to look at it. It's a 2-page derivation. And we won't require you to understand or know how to derive the Kalman filter or understand the multivariate statistics surrounding it. Okay. As Professor Chenoy said, we really just want this class to be fun. And in 10 years from now, we don't want you to remember how to implement the Kalman filter recursion. All we want you to remember is that the Kalman filter, the intuition behind it. What is it doing? Why is it performing better than the optimal linear estimator, for example? And we'll get into that intuition today, and we hope that that intuition is what you take from this class. All right, any questions on this? All right, then let's get into the Kalman filter. So there was this paper in 2008 to 2009. This is a paper that I also mentioned at the end of last lecture, where they made 2 types of decoders. The first they called the linear filter, but this is just a Wiener filter. Some people in the field call it a linear filter as well. And what they did is they, with this linear filter, they decoded the position of the cursor from human data. So they had human participants who were participating in a clinical trial. This was done at Massachusetts General Hospital / Brown University, a collaboration there called BrainGate. For participant S3 across different days, day 40, day 48, and day 54, they used this Wiener filter decoding position. And this jarbled mess that you see are the individual trials where they updated the position of the cursor based off of this Wiener filter. And right below it, all we are plotting here are the average traces of those trajectories to each of the 4 directions. And so from this analysis, from this live decoding, what they concluded was that the Wiener filter can, in general, go to the correct direction, but it's pretty noisy. And sometimes the average trajectory doesn't even get out to the target that you wanted. And so this isn't a great decoder to use and not easy for the participants to use. And then what the study did is they also implemented a velocity-based Kalman filter. And so again, they're showing plots of the decoded trajectories for participant S3 across many days. And what they showed was that on most of the days, right, this day was more anomalous, but on most of the days, the trajectories went pretty straight towards the targets. And they looked a lot cleaner than the Wiener filter trajectories that were decoding position. And so from this, they concluded that the velocity Kalman filter is sort of the state-of-the-art decoder to use. And so if you want to decode with neural activity, you should use a velocity-based Kalman filter. As I mentioned at the last lecture, there are a few problems with the study. One is that here they're decoding velocity, but for the Wiener filter, they decoded position. And we know from several analyses that the velocity data has more variability, has more variance encoded in the neural data. So it's easier to decode velocity than it is to decode position. And so that's one reason that the Kalman filter might have done better. And another reason is because in their Wiener filter, they use a history of 1 second, which, as we talked about, is a really long amount of history and causes there to be a lot of lag to the subjects changing, to the participants changing intention. And so in the monkey lab, I actually started off by using 1 second history, and it was horrendous. And I kept decreasing that. We got to 250 eventually, but even at 400 or 500 milliseconds of history, there was way too much lag in the system, and so performance was quite poor at that point. But anyways, this paper came and said velocity Kalman filters, you get these really nice straight trajectories. We should all be using this. All right, and so this video that you're going to see here is the video from this paper. Whoa. I'm not sure what that was. This video is from this paper that was the required reading. Oh, okay. By Gilja and Niyajikian. And so this is using a Kalman filter. And you can see the cursor moves very straight to each target. When it gets to each target, it's able to stop on the target and hold it for 500 milliseconds. And so it has both good, really precise velocity control to each target. And when it gets to each target, it's able to stop right over it. All right, any questions on any of these? All right. All right, so what's the intuition behind the Kalman filter? And so let's start off with the following equation, right? This equation is sort of inspired from our tuning models where we said that the neural data was a function of the kinematics. And in the various homeworks, you've been able to solve for this f when this f was a cosine. So let's just say that we had a linear equation because linear things are always very simple to work with. Linear approximations, of course, are approximations. The neural data in the brain is not a linear combination of the kinematics. It's very nonlinear, in fact. But using linear systems will allow us to actually solve for these systems exactly. And so we're going to write that the neural data, the yk, is equal to c times xk. In the previous lecture, we said that xk was just the velocities, vxk and vyk, so the x and y velocity at time k. But then for the rest of this Kalman filter lecture, and you guys will see soon, our kinematics are now going to just be the position of the cursor at time k, the velocity of the cursor at time k in both dimensions, and our one term, our constant one term. And so, so we'll say our neural data, these are, again, exactly as in last lecture, the bin spike counts in some window. It's just a linear it's just a linear mapping of the kinematics. And so if this kinematics matrix here is 5 by 1, and the neural matrix is 96 by 1, we'll have that the C matrix is 96 by 5. So as in last lecture, given only this equation, we know how we might decode from it. Right? We have an equation that relates the kinematics to the neural data, and we know what that mapping is. That mapping is C. So now if we want to take the neural data and decode the kinematics, all we have to do is invert C. C is not invertible, so we're going to use our trick that we learned in last lecture of just using the pseudo-inverse. And so as in the last lecture, what we could do is we could solve for C. C we know how to solve for by just grabbing our neural data, our big matrix Y, having all the neural data concatenated across time k, making the similar matrix X of all of our kinematics concatenated across all time. And then we would say that C is just equal to Y times X dagger. Exactly the same thing that we did in last lecture. And so after we get the C matrix, what we could do is we could decode kinematics by simply applying the pseudo-inverse to both sides of this equation up here. And we would get that the decoded kinematics is C pseudo-inverse times yk. Any questions on this? All clear to everyone? Relating the kinematics to the neural data. But what if we had more information about the kinematics? And so what if they obeyed the laws of physics? And so this is an example that we talked about from handout 12, where we were just looking at a ball falling. And we said that we could write the kinematics at time k plus 1 as some function of the kinematics at time k. That function was linear, and it just put to use our equations from Newtonian mechanics. And so, for example, if we were to look at the second row here, we would get that p of k plus 1 in the y direction, right? Here, y is equal to 0, 1. So this one term is picking out this term right here. So it's equal to p y of k plus this delta t term is corresponding to this velocity term here, plus vk of y delta t, plus, and then this constant here is multiplying this 1. So this is minus 1/2 g delta t squared, where g is just gravity. And so, no surprise, we went over this equation. But what this equation is fundamentally telling us is additional information. It's telling us that there's another equation that we have for xk, and that's this relationship through time, that xk plus 1 is equal to a times xk. And this is a dynamical equation that tells us how xk updates through time. And so what we did is we generated a video example to give you some intuition. I'm not sure how it'll come out on the slides here, but you can imagine this landscape. And it's intentionally quite dark because we're imagining that we're taking a video at dusk. And so in this nice landscape, let's just imagine that we're going to fire a cannonball. And so you can see this cannonball passing through this landscape. And the cannonball behaves exactly as we would predict from high school physics. It follows a parabolic trajectory. And we can calculate exactly, if we know the initial velocity of the cannonball, we can calculate exactly where it's going to land up, or where it's going to end, what height it's going to reach, et cetera. And so let me proceed. Oh. OK. And so what we can do is we can use this video to simply observe the trajectory. But then let's imagine that this picture, that we're taking a video of the trajectory, and now we no longer know anything about physics. And what we want to do is we want to trace out the flight of this cannonball. And so, sorry, this video is supposed to be running, but it's not. OK, well, anyways, let's say our video is very noisy. And so we are using a very old video camera with very poor resolution. So all I've done here is I've taken all the pixels and I've just averaged them so that our resolution has gone down quite a bit. And then because it's dusk and it's very dark outside, we also know that there's noisiness in observing these pixels. So the photons incoming will have Poisson noise. So I'll add Poisson noise to this picture. And then we'll say that we don't know anything about physics, and we want to trace out what the flight of this cannonball would be. And so if we were to then fire off our cannonball, let's see. You'll see that little black cannonball going through the sky, but it's pretty hard to make it out, right? And if I were to just draw a trajectory of what that flight looked like based off of this very noisy video, I might get something that looks like this blue line right here. Now, let's put back on our physics cap. We know that if you were to just infer the trajectory based off of these observations, you would get something that's pretty reasonable, right? It would still look like a parabola. But there are some things about this trajectory that we can fix. Right? What are some of them? We can smooth it out, yeah. So one is that we know that the cannonball, right, if it's falling, can't just defy gravity and float up, right? The cannonball, if it's going down, should always go down, right? There's this little part here where the cannonball seems to go backwards in the x direction. And we know that that can't happen either. And so if we were just decoding based off, if we were just trying to get the trajectory of this cannonball based off of these noisy observations, we would get something quite noisy indeed. And so to just put this into a picture, we have our cannonball being fired. And sorry, we can hit the lights now. We have then our low resolution video camera that's videoing the flight of this cannonball. And what we get is this noisy blue trajectory because our observations are both low resolution and noisy, mimicking how our electrode arrays themselves are very low resolution. We're only sampling one neuron every 400 micrometers, and very noisy. They have Poisson noise on them. And so if we were to just go off the observations, we would get this noisy trajectory that does not obey the laws of physics. The trajectory at some point shows the cannonball defying the laws of gravity, right? But if we were to incorporate knowledge of Newtonian mechanics, then what we could do is we could get a much better estimate of the cannonball's flight. And the way that we did this is we used knowledge of physics. All right? Is that example all clear to everyone? Any questions on it? All right, so formally, we're now going to write this as a dynamical system. And so before we had this equation, yk equals c times xk, that told us how the neural data is informative of the kinematics, the x's. And now we're going to add an additional equation. So this x here describes the kinematics, and we're going to say this A matrix is going to model things like the inertia of the cursor, that if it's going to the right, it should keep going to the right unless the velocity is getting close to 0. And together, these two equations are called a linear dynamical system. And this is the topic of EE263. Some terminology, we usually call this top equation here the dynamics, or equivalently, the state update process. And this terminology makes sense because it's how the state, the kinematics, are updating through time. And we'll call this equation right here the observation process. And we call it the observation process because it tells us how our observations are informative of our kinematics. And so before, we just decoded by taking the pseudo-inverse of this equation. But now we have this additional equation that gives us more information into what the kinematics xk actually are. And so concretely, what this means is that this extra information, this extra equation that we have here, should help us to arrive at an even better solution than xk hat equals the pseudo-inverse times yk. And it's exactly this intuition that we saw from this cannonball example. If we know additional rules by which the kinematic should update, we should be able to use those rules to get a better estimate. Any questions on this slide? This is one of the major intuition slides. Nick?
Don't we normally use some type of control term for the dynamics equation? I mean, it seems like it would just, we're not incorporating the fact that you can control it somehow. It just runs autonomously.
Yeah. So Nick is referring to a term that we will commonly see added to this, which is plus b times uk. And then there will be a plus d times uk here. Now, this is definitely a more complete, or this is, for one, because you have more terms, it's a more, it can model the data better, because now you're allowing for these inputs to describe what's going on. However, for example, for these inputs, for a cannonball flying, we know that there isn't a UK, because unless someone was applying an input to the cannonball. But for the monkey's arm, his positions and velocities, this UK is something like the monkey's intention to accelerate or to decelerate or to change directions suddenly. And so in the setting of neural prostheses, we don't really have a good sense of what this UK might look like. And so what we do for now is we'll just ignore it. But there is new research going into how can we model these inputs, which would be some sort of latent variable. Anjali?
So you can say that both of them are UKs?
Yeah. So in typical control theory, and you would see this in EE263, you would have some input that you can apply that modifies the state and the observations. And they affect the state differently due to this B and this D matrix. Yeah. That's also why we call these A and C, right? Some people would be like, why don't you call them A and B? And that's because people usually reserve B and D for these inputs. But we'll just, for the rest of the class, we'll ignore these B and Ds. All right. And so now the question of the Kalman filter is, how do we get an optimal estimate of the x hat of k from these two equations? And so the first thing that we have to recognize is that neither of these equations are perfect. And so if one of these equations were perfect, so let's just take the observation process. If the neural data was just a linear combination of the kinematics, and that equation was perfect, then I wouldn't need the state update equation, right? Because then from my neural data, I could perfectly decode the kinematics. And so to make this rigorous, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to know the noise and know the statistics of the noise, because depending on what that noise is, it'll tell me how to weight the observation process information versus the state update process information. So this is now venturing into the land of multivariate statistics. I'll hope to explain this notation, but again, there isn't any expectation that you'll have to rigorously know exactly what is going on at every step. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to add a noise term to both of these equations, which means that they're imperfect. And so for the state update equation, we add this W of k. And for the observation process, we add this Q of k. And these are multivariate noise terms, meaning that they're vectors themselves. So this WK is what dimensionality? Can anyone tell me? Yeah, so WK here is a 5 by 1 vector. And then QK is a 96 by 1 vector. All right, so we'll just take a brief aside to describe what these WK and QK looks like. And so for the rest of this class, we're going to assume that these noise terms are Gaussian, which means that they arise from a multivariate normal Gaussian distribution, and that they have zero mean, and that they have these matrices here called covariance matrices of capital W and capital Q. And so what are these matrices W and Q? They inherently describe how the different dimensions, the dimensions being for WK, it was 5 by 1, so it has 5 dimensions. How do these dimensions covary with each other? And so very concretely, if I take WK and I say that it has a covariance matrix W, this means that if our vector W, and here's 3 by 1 instead of 5 by 1, if it just had 3 elements of noise, W1, W2, and W3, then the covariance matrix would be a 3 by 3 matrix. If W was 5 by 1, then the covariance would be a 5 by 5 matrix. And each term in the matrix is describing how the dimension in the row covaries with the dimension in the column. And so the covarying of dimension 1 with dimension 1 is just this variance. And so on the diagonals, this will be the variance of dimension 1, the variance of dimension 2, and the variance of dimension 3. Now, on these off-diagonal elements, these terms covariance are just describing how the noise is correlated, if it is. So if the noise is completely independent in all of these dimensions, then all these covariance terms will equal 0, and we'll just have a diagonal matrix. But it could be the chance, you could have the chance that maybe W2 is equal to 0.5 W1. And so you could have a common noise source that affects both dimensions. And if they're covarying in this way, if you add noise to the first dimension, if the first dimension noise looks like this, then the second dimension's noise would look something like this. And they would be covarying with each other. And so that's why this matrix W will also capture the covariance between the different dimensions. And so this matrix W is basically a very full description of the noise properties of each of these dimensions and how they covary with each other. All right, Nathan?
So if none of those are related, if they're all independent from each other, then there is no covariance.
Exactly. So if the noise is independent, then all of these terms will go to 0. And then W will just be a diagonal matrix where for every single term in the diagonal, you just have the variance of that dimension. One other thing to note is that this is a symmetric matrix. So the covariance of W2 and W1 is exactly equal to the covariance of W1 and W2. And so these two terms here will be equal. And similarly, this term, covariance of W3 over covariance W3, comma W1, will be equal to this term, covariance W1, comma W3. So again, at a high level, this is just a quick description of what these matrices are describing. We won't ever ask you to calculate one of these covariance matrices. We just want you to get the big picture that this matrix W is inherently describing how variable each of my dimensions are. And because we have this matrix W, the Kalman filter is going to know how to weight each of these dimensions. And so if W1 is a really noisy dimension, and W2 is pretty noisy and correlated with W1, but W3 is really low noise, then naturally the Kalman filter will take this information, which is encoded in this matrix, that W3 is small, and use that to upweight dimension 3. That's the big picture of how these covariance matrices come into play. Any further questions on that? All right. All right, and so the Kalman filter, again, is how we get the optimal estimate of x of k from these two equations. Now, in general, knowing how to meld these two equations is very complicated. And so there is the Kalman filter, but the Kalman filter only works under certain assumptions. And the assumptions are that these dynamics are linear. So these equations here, xk plus 1 equals axk, are linear equations. But if, for example, in my observation process, I instead had y of k is equal to c squared times x of k, where c is some scalar, this is now a nonlinear equation. And we couldn't use our vanilla Kalman filter to do this. We would have to start making approximations. And the other assumption that we make is Gaussian noise. And so that means that the distributions of these w's and these q's are Gaussian, as we described in the previous lecture. That is, that wk arises from something that has a normal sign here. And so I want to emphasize again that these assumptions aren't actually true in real life. For our neural data, it isn't linearly related to the kinematics. And for our noise, it's not Gaussian. In fact, a better model would be for this qk here to be Poisson, right? Because it's modeling some function of the y's. And we know that when we taught you about the spike rate statistics of this neural data, we told you that they were Poisson rather than Gaussian. And so these are approximations. But what they do is they allow us to build the Kalman filter and actually arrive at an exact solution for what xk should be given all of these parameters. Right? All right, so this is the take-home point behind the entire Kalman filter, which is now instead of using only the neural data to decode the kinematics, we now also use the previously decoded kinematics. Because the previously decoded kinematics, that's x hat of k minus 1, has information about what x hat of k should be. And that could take into account the cursor's inertia or the dynamics of a robotic arm, as we've said several times. And so in this case, our decoding equation has now been updated. So instead of the x hat of k being just a linear combination of the yk's, we now have that x hat of k is equal to some matrix times x hat of k minus 1. So this describes the evolution of the state, and then plus some neural data times the matrix. And so this describes the observations. And so basically, the Kalman filter is just a vote. And so you have two competing sources of information. You have the kinematic update process. So you have the vote from xk minus 1. And you have a vote from yk. And these two sources of information will be weighted together to give the new updated decoded kinematics. Right? So before I go on, I wanted to ask a conceptual question, which is, in this equation here, we only have that the x of k's is relying on the neural data y of k's. And we saw from the OLE that if we just decode off of the raw neural data, it'll be very noisy. But in general, we see that Kalman filters are quite smooth. And so what's the fundamental reason for that? What is doing the smoothing in this equation? Yep. Ingot?
Kinematics have information of the previous
Exactly, that's exactly right. And so, so if we were to actually, so let's just take an example. Let's say x10 is equal to m1 times x9 plus m2 times y10, right? This was us decoding the kinematics at x of 10. If I could expand this out to be equal to m1 times x hat of 9 now is what? Is m1 times x hat of 8 plus m2 times y9 times y9 plus m2 times y10. And then this we could expand out even more, but eventually we would get something. And so, as Ingod said, you already see now y9 is starting to appear here. And so we have an equation with y9 and y9 and y10. And if we were to expand out this x hat of 8, then we would get a y8 out of here. And so really what this equation looks like is it looks like m2 times y10 plus m1, m2 times y9, right? All I've done is I've taken this m1, multiplied it by m2, and made it, and copied that term down here, plus m1 squared times m2 times y8 plus dot, 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 right? What does this equation look like? Have we seen something like this before? Sorry? Oh. Nick? It looked like an exponential. That's correct. The m1s will keep increasing exponentially. But if you guys will recall, we had our Wiener filter equation, right? Which was x hat of k is equal to sum p equals 0 to p of L p times yk minus p, right? And so there's a correspondence between this equation right here and this equation. So concretely, L0 would be equal to m2, right? That's for p equals 0. If I plug in p equals 0 here, I just get a y. If I plug in a p equals 0 here, I just get a yk. And then L0 is multiplying yk. And so for here, yk was just equal to y10. And so L0 would be m2. And then similarly, L1 is equal to m1 times m2, et cetera. And so you can think of this Kalman filter as a Wiener filter with a certain structure on these L matrices. And as Ingod mentioned, it's these M1s, these kinematics, which are effectively doing our smoothing through time through this exponentiation. Right? Is that all clear to everyone? All right. And so we'll stop at this slide today, but what before we go into, actually, we'll go 2 more slides. The Kalman filter, at a very high level, is a recursive way to calculate these M1 and M2s, and hence arrive at our state estimate of x hat of k. So in our linear dynamical system, we had 4 parameters. The 4 parameters were A, C, W, and Q. And so we know that these M1 and M2s basically have to be a function of these A, W, C, and Qs. And so the Kalman filter will tell us exactly what these functions are. And so a few notes. The next slides will tell us the solution of the Kalman filter, and we'll start with that on Wednesday. And again, I just want to emphasize that you won't be responsible for the derivative of x of k minus 1 plus m2 of k times y of k. However, even though it's time varying, these m1s and these m2s converge to a steady state value after some amount of time. Now, depending on your application, this convergence might be quite slow. But then for neural prostheses, which is what we're going to be using our Kalman filters for the rest of this class, this convergence occurs on the order of seconds. And when we have the monkey controlling these cursors, he's controlling it for tens of minutes to hours, far longer than seconds. And so you would only have a discrepancy from this time varying assumption within the first seconds of decoding. But then after that, they would converge to steady state values. And so for the rest of this class, what we're going to do is we're going to assume that M1 and M2 are static. But then if you're doing this in another application, I want you to remember that there's a chance that M1 and M2 may have something meaningful in their time variation. And so you don't want to always assume a static M1 and M2. All right? Any last questions before we break? All right. Have a good day.